thank you for the introduction. So now it's time to get cozy for our little fireside chat. And I'm very happy that 3 of our community extension developers, real fire,
Nice.
are actually joining me and are willing to share some experiences and maybe some inside stories about community extension development. I quickly want to introduce the speakers here. So very far on left or your right is Stephen Roughley. He is the person behind the Vernalis extension, and he's also the KNIME contributor of the month of January of this year. Again, congratulations about that.
Thank you.
He's actually a principal scientist for medicinal chemistry and cheminformatics at Vernalis, and in 2011, or 2010, sorry, he first got his hands on KNIME. And what's actually really interesting, he actually learned writing Java code using the Java snippets node in KNIME. And now he's the lead developer for the Vernalis extension, which is not only used in the life sciences, but also provides a really wide range of useful nodes. Happy to have you here.
Thank you.
Next to him, we have Julianus. Julianus is currently a postdoc at the Zuse Institute for Applied Mathematics and Computer Science in Berlin. He already used KNIME during his master's when he analyzed high-throughput data, and that was back in 2013, I remember, so also a long time ago. During his PhD, he focused then on mass spec data and got heavily involved with the development of OpenMS. Just in case if you don't know, OpenMS is an open source C++ and Python library that is used to analyze data from mass spectrometers, which identify and quantify chemical substances. And now Julianus is responsible here for the OpenMS integration in KNIME.
Yes.
Great to have you. And then last but not least, we have Manuel Schwarze here. Manuel Schwarze is a software architect, technical lead and developer at Novartis currently. And after 8 years in IT security department, he actually wanted to take some more interesting use cases, I think, and he switched over to the research units of Novartis, which is called NIBR, Novartis Institute for Biomedical Research. And there he first implemented the paperless lab for chemists. And then in 2011, so also a long time ago, he got first in contact with KNIME when he started to implement NIBR-specific nodes, but also the RDKit nodes. And just as an information, the RDKit is an open source cheminformatics toolbox that is broadly used in industry as well as academia. And now he's one of the main developers and maintainers of the RDKit extension. So it's great to have you here on stage. So you all have been with KNIME over like a decade now. So I bet you have several stories and experiences to share. But I actually want to go right very much to the beginning. So really, why did you start to develop an extension? Why did you not develop just a standalone application? What was the benefit that you saw to develop an extension? Manuel?
Shall I start?
Yeah.
Well, in short, my boss at that time made me to. This is the simple story. That boss is still around, not with Novartis, but with KNIME a bit. Greg Landrum, many of you may know him who work in life science. He is one of the fathers of RDKit as cheminformatics library. And after I finished my project, he had to give me some work, and I ended up with KNIME. And I'm very grateful to him that he did that, because very interesting job. And at that time, his goal, I think, was to enable our bench chemists to actually do something that Eli Lilly has successfully done at that time, to bring them together with KNIME and to enable them to, without programming knowledge, without coding knowledge, to do something meaningful with data and with the RDKit at that time. And at that time, we didn't have many RDKit nodes, so one of the main tasks was to write them.
Okay, interesting. How was it for you?
So for us, it was, again, it was the person who is now my boss, James Davidson, who some of you who've been in the KNIME community for a long time will know. He instituted us using KNIME to explore what we could do with it as a company. And one of the things that we wanted to do was automate searching a public database called the Protein Data Bank, which holds crystal structures of proteins mainly, with small molecules bound to them in many cases. which is kind of fundamental to what we do as a startup pharmaceutical company. And so we had that node written by a guy called Dave Morley, who used to work with us. We actually released it on our own website originally, and I have no idea whether anybody ever found it through that route. And then back in 2013, we re-released it as an official community contribution. And the idea for us, I think, was that we were starting to use RDKit and a number of other open source projects, and we felt it was only fair that if we were using open source code for free, that we should maybe contribute something back. So that was where we started.
Yeah, for us it was the reason that mass spec experiments can be vastly different depending on which kind of molecules you analyze, what kind of mass spec you use, what kind of separation, what kind of quantification. And so the philosophy behind OpenMS was always based on giving users the flexibility of designing their analysis according to their needs. And this screams for like a user interface that looks like a workflow editor, basically. And actually, we started to develop one on our own, but quickly realized that we are more the science guys, and we don't really want to, and we cannot keep up with other platforms that do that regularly, that do that as their focus. And so we were looking for such a platform, and we immediately found KNIME, which was also largely had an academic background as well. It was open source. It was already in the chem informatics field, so that was nice for us. And yeah, it would just have not been feasible to develop one UI where you have like huge menu bars where you have to decide, oh, for this step, I want to use this algorithm. For this step, I want to use this algorithm. So KNIME was just the perfect thing for us.
So it's actually interesting. And do you see any other functionalities, for example, that KNIME provided that really benefited your user base?
Yeah, I think certainly one advantage was, and it's become much more so in the last 10 years, is the fact that there are lots of different tools that all integrate. So we use, as well as the RDKit community contribution and some of the community contributions, we also use at least 3 of the different partner contributions which offer licensed software. But those, to use those together, you end up having to export files manually into different formats and then reload them into new software packages. And that's generally a route to mistakes. And the fact that in KNIME we can just put a whole workflow together where we take something from one of our own nodes, we put it into one of Manuel's nodes, we put it into some of the partner nodes, and there's no opportunity for the data to go missing or get corrupted. And each step of the way you can see what's happened to it as well. So you can check visually that you really have done what you think you've done.
Yeah. For us, as a C++ based framework, it was really nice to have easy access to nice visualizations, because that's usually very tedious to do in C++. Our Python wrappers came later, I think. And the funny thing is, like the extensions that I use the most are probably the ones from the 2 guys here, because like once you're finished with your mass spec analysis, especially when it gets to metabolomics, you want to actually visualize what you found in your experiment, and then or look up in huge biological or chemical databases, and that's where those 2 extensions shine.
What I think is also interesting that both or all of your extensions are actually open source. So far I always had the perception that pharma companies are rather reluctant to share anything that they are doing, but Vernalis and Novartis both seemingly approved that. How was the process? Was it easy? And what was the benefit of Vernalis and Novartis approving and contributing to open source?
So I think the first few times we did it, it was difficult. We had to talk to our legal people about software licenses, and actually we were quite lucky in that there was already the Eli Lilly open source contribution, the Wood nodes. So we could say to them, well, look, here's Eli Lilly, they're a big pharmaceutical company, they're doing it, this is the license they use. So we used that as an example. After we'd done a couple of updates, and they sort of said, well, is it the same as last time? We said, yes, all the same. It was decided that actually we didn't need to talk to the legal team every time and treat it simply as a normal publication. So we go through our publications approval process, which just looks at if there's anything proprietary in there, which generally there isn't. Generally the proprietary bit is what we would do with the nodes and what data we run through them, rather than the nodes themselves. So it's become relatively simple, and we have gone from a forum post where somebody's requested a feature or requested something that happens to be a node we'd already had written internally. We have in the past gone from that forum post to releasing the node within 24 hours. So it can be quite quick. It wasn't as difficult as I anticipated, and I think possibly even back in 2010, 2013, it was less common, I think. I think it's probably got more common for pharmaceutical companies to release things to the open source community. Manuel, I don't know how that...
Yeah, and in our case, I think when Greg joined Novartis, he was already involved with the RDKit as open source platform, and he also continued to contribute, and it came kind of natural that when you have an open source platform now with KNIME and you want to marry it with something else open source, that those contributions have to be open source. So I don't know what he has gone through, but what I remember from what I picked up was that our CIO at that time was very, very supportive with this whole thing, and also our legal head was very supportive. There was not any kind of approval item or so in our legal process for software at that time. Now it is. So there are other open source contributions also from other colleagues. I don't know how many, to be honest, but it was a process that we were encouraged to do that. I remember that still from 10 years ago, so when this all started, when I got involved there. And I really like that, because I think as a big company making a lot of money, I think we kind of earn the community to give something back. Everybody is using open source. So many libraries I'm as a software developer I'm relying on based on open source, so why wouldn't we give something back? Right? I think it's just fair.
Yeah, I think that's very similar to us, and certainly we've released other bits of software and lots of bits of sort of lab, sort of homemade in inverted commas lab equipment, where we release bits of code through the open source community now, not within the KNIME platform even, but I think for us the KNIME release was the sort of prototype, and once our management saw that we could do that, and people heard about it and used it and talked to them about it when they talked to them about collaborations, they got much keener on it, and it's not really an issue now. It's a fairly simple process.
I mean, but about the licensing, this is usually a part that could be worrying. I'm fortunate again that Greg took care of that. But if I would start something new, I would probably just look what are the others doing. I would probably consult with the KNIME guys to see how the community works. And then I guess usually this is the way to do it anyway, right? I mean, there are not that many licenses in the open source world. There are a handful or a dozen maybe that are used most. And then you have to pick what makes sense.
Yeah,
it's a one-time thing. Once you have those processes, it's always the same kind of release process that you have to go through.
Let's hope some pharma companies might follow your example. I don't know. So now let's actually move on a bit more to the technical side. I would also be interested in how did you actually get started? What was to develop your community extension? What was easy? What was complicated? Or what knowledge is needed to actually develop a community extension? Julianus?
So we started very basic. When we evaluated KNIME, we saw they had this external tool nodes, and in an even more basic form back then. And that was actually something that we already needed. Like, our tools are command line tools, and we don't want to show the command line to the users. We want them to explore this visually. But for over 100 tools, it's just not feasible to wrap all of them in like a component, for example, or configuring everyone based on the options that the command line tool has. So we approached KNIME, and I think we were lucky that, as I said, they have such an academic background, so they were very helpful, and they guided us to actually develop a plugin that allows us to easily and automatically wrap our tools into KNIME as native nodes. And yeah, so I just encourage, especially if you're a university or some other academic institution, to approach their academic alliance that they have by now. They will probably give you good hints on where to start. And yeah, in general, start easy. Look what's there already. Maybe start with the scripting nodes, with the Java snippet nodes, and then if you see you don't achieve what you actually want to achieve, then start thinking about developing your own nodes, your own plugins, and yeah, make use of the community then.
But Stephen, you started just learning Java when you started.
So I guess my route was a bit different from these guys in that I was a chemist, I was lab-based, and I was starting to use KNIME, and I had no Java experience whatsoever. So I did. It really is true. People asked me last night, was it true that I learned to write Java in the Java snippet? That is absolutely true. And it was what's now called the Java snippet simple, so there was no help at all in there. And so there was a big learning curve, really, for me. I had a number of use cases where I was having to write the same or a very similar Java snippet time after time. And I got to the point where I thought, well, if I'm writing this in a Java snippet, then I'm writing Java, and nodes are written in Java, so it can't be that difficult to do. And there was an online sort of step-by-step tutorial to follow, which I tried to follow. And I think the first time I got halfway through, and I realized that, no, I didn't know what I was doing, and I was lost. I tried it again, and I think nobody would have been more surprised than me when I started up the KNIME instance for the first time and I actually saw my own node was sat there, and it worked. So that's where I started. And then when we re-released as a community contribution officially, we put a couple of extra nodes in that I'd written internally, as well as the original node that Dave Morley wrote for as the PDB connector. And of course, what I hadn't really thought of at that point was that meant that I was now responsible for that node, which was probably at the time the most complicated node we had. And certainly at the time it's probably still one of the most complicated nodes we have. So I don't think I knew what I'd let myself in for when I did that. So definitely, I think learning Java would be, well now there's a route through Python, but I don't know anything about the Python route. I haven't used it. But learning either Java or Python would be essential. And then asking for help. The number of questions that I sent Bernd and Torsten, who are two old faces at KNIME, in the early days, which they probably had to go away and shake their heads a few minutes before they came back to answer. And then I went on a KNIME run developer training course, which is hosted in Zurich in 2014. And that was a big help, not least because as well as just learning how to write nodes properly and what all the best practices were, I learned quite a lot of tricks around the whole Eclipse environment, which again was another piece of learning curve.
That's how I started. That was my first thing, actually, to take the developer training. Sitting in a classroom, a real classroom with this guy there, Thomas Gabriel and Peter Ohl, top management of KNIME today. Yeah, that was nice. It was 12 years ago or so. And then I wrote my first 2 nodes or so, and then I realized, oh man, what I learned in that developer training, yeah, I need that. But I can't go on like that, because if I would have continued like that, I would have taken years to write all those RDKit nodes. So the next thing I was doing was sitting down and thinking, okay, I'm have to write so much gluing code, this is not right. I need a framework or something. And since I'm a software developer, I was sitting down and thinking this through from an architecture point, and then created that framework. Also stole a bit of ideas from the KNIME guys, because when you do KNIME development, there is a nice wizard actually in Eclipse that generates you source code already, which makes it a bit easier. So I stole that idea, generated my own wizard based on your wizard, and then generated for the 5 main use cases or so source code that I just had to fill out the snippets then with the real scientific code that we needed. And this was really worth it. It was a first-time investment, of course. I don't know how many months or weeks I worked on that, but it saved so much time. Then afterwards, I had every 2 weeks or so my status meeting with Greg, where he gave me the specifications of a new node or 2 nodes, and then the nodes came just out. So this was really, really fast then, and that's why we have quite many. And they were not created in the last 10 years. They were created 2011, 2012, and from that time on maintained. And here and there a new node, yes, but not that many.
I have to say, looking back at the last 10 years of KNIME development, node development actually became much easier. Like you can, these days there are node development APIs for JavaScript, for Python. There are Maven archetypes that create templates for you where like all the boilerplate code is already generated for you. And as we said, probably also wizards, which is a very similar thing, I think, where you just fill out your code and don't have to worry about all the boilerplate.
There are other frameworks. And actually you created also your own framework,
yes,
right?
For wrapping
together
the
with the KNIME guys, but to wrap the toolings, it's also like a framework, which makes it so easy then. And that's the cool thing also about KNIME, that it lets you do that, right? It doesn't put you in very, very narrow borders or so, but it opens up.
Yeah.
That's the beauty. Yeah.
Cool. I think maybe some people are now excited to start their own or develop their own extension, but I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience or online questions. Are there any? Thorsten, I think you're right. The light is pretty bright. Phil? Oh, sorry.
Hi, just a quick question. The fire must be incredibly hot. You're sitting so close to it. I think you need to sit back a little bit. Just kidding. The question was around the additional skill sets you guys would need. So you're talking about developing all the add-ons. What sort of additional advanced skill sets do you require?
What additional skills?
Yeah.
I mean, in my case, I came already with Java knowledge. That was definitely an asset. But I needed to know how KNIME works, so that developer training is something that you have to do. And then, of course, you should have an understanding of the business domain that you're working for. Now, in my case, I'm not a chemist. Those guys are. And that's, of course, usually that would be a challenge. So I needed the brain behind me, which was Greg, to give me the right specifications, to give me the right test cases, and then I could do the work. But without him, nothing of that would have happened. And after he left Novartis, that's one of the reasons why there are not that many nodes afterwards, because it's harder then to work with somebody if he's not sitting 2 desks away. Yeah, but beside that, there's not so much additional things, I believe, from the skill set. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I have my own team developing this stuff, and it just sounds like maybe a step beyond in terms of what the regular developer would be doing day to day. But I think you're telling me that it's not really something.
When I thought about the kind of a skill thing, I added in my list a point 0, which is you need a good idea first. You need to know what you want to do. Now, in my case, that came from my boss, but if you want to start an extension, you should have a good use case, right? Not only just a very little thing, then you end up with one node, and that's a lot of effort then if you want to open source that, I guess. But if you have a larger business case, then it's certainly worth doing that. If it's something that is new, or something where you're convinced that you can do it better than what others have done already.
I would add that some DevOps skills might be helpful as well.
Yeah.
So that you can do some continuous integration and deployment of your extensions, so you can always test that they're still working, especially if you want to become a trusted extension, where you also have to make sure that they're secure, no vulnerabilities listed, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, certainly the KNIME team sort of sort out all the sort of continuous integration, continuous deployment from the community side, but if you want to do your own internal stuff, then you need to figure that out, which I'm sure they're happy to help with, but ultimately you need to do it yourself, and you're going to have to look after that as well, which was another thing that I didn't know anything about when I started.
I think you can learn that, and
you can
Gabriel from KNIME is so helpful with that all the time. That's true. But talking about DevOps, one thing that you should also have and put some thought into that is, how do you test sufficiently? That's very important. That's what you learn also at the developer training. But it really, really is important, not only for other software, but with KNIME it's really, really easy. They have great processes in place to make it easy for you as a developer. And I can tell you a lot of stories how often it saved my ass that I had those tests in place because I made some change. I didn't think of that they may have side effects, but yeah, of course they did. That's what the test tells you, right, when it fails. And then you can fix it. Without those tests, somebody else would have found that bug from the community, and then it's embarrassing, of course.
Yeah.
That happens. One last question from Phil.
Yeah, a question for all three of you. Question for all three of you. I am now an expert in my topic, so I know my use case. I can call my tool externally with the call external tool node. Banjo says it's gotten better. I can call it as a snippet from R or Python or Java or whatever. When should I consider turning it into proper nodes and extension?
I would say it's as soon as, it's more about a feeling, as soon as your business or use case requires it, I would say. I think you will soon see that you actually might want to have a configuration dialog. You don't want your users to see those huge scripts, for example. You want views at some point that are immediately integrated into the node, not some components that consist of many, many nodes. And you want to ship your code very easily. You don't want people to have to, I don't know, in the beginning of our plugin, I think you still had to install some third-party Microsoft thingies. And after your plugin, you can add additional steps that are done during installation, for example. So,
yeah, I would say a lot of it is a gut feeling, and I think a lot of it comes down to how difficult it is to set that snippet up, whatever form it is, each time, and how often you're doing it. If it's something that you set it up once and it runs and it stays running, and that's it, then there's probably no need to write a node. If it's something where you're going to use it in new workflows every day, every week, then I would definitely think about writing a node.
We had it happen quite a few times that either I or one of our power users in KNIME were creating components. And that do already what you want, but components are also quite large workflows. You have to maintain them, and you get to the point then usually where you think, well, should we maybe develop a node for that? Not an extension in that case, right? So it's not really the answer for your question, but a node. Yeah. And then it would become part of our neighbor plugin. But you ask about extensions, so if I would have a couple of those useful nodes, then yeah, maybe we could open source them if they are worth it. But often it starts to do this stuff already with what KNIME offers, and we want to just kind of simplify it, make it easier to have it part of a normal node repository and part of our plugin.
And the good thing is, once you have an extension, it's super easy to add one or another node. Yeah.
Cool. With that, I would end this session for now. If you are interested now and to develop your own extension, there is also the Birds of a Feather stand where Steffen and someone else, I think Gabriel is sick, but someone else is there to also answer your questions if you want to try it on your own. But also, you can ask our 3 speakers in the break and ask them all the questions that you didn't get a chance to ask now. So thank you very much. Thanks for joining me. It was a pleasure. And have a nice break, everyone.